You are not in charge. This is not a philosophical provocation. It is a finding measured, replicated, and published in the most rigorous journals in psychology and neuroscience. The conscious mind, the part of you that reads these words, that deliberates, that believes it is making decisions, controls approximately 5% of your cognitive activity. The remaining 95% is conducted by the unconscious mind, the vast, silent, invisible machinery that operates below the threshold of awareness, processing millions of bits of information per second, generating the thoughts you think are yours, producing the decisions you believe you are making, and running the biological systems that keep you alive without ever asking your permission or reporting its activity to your conscious awareness. Gerald Zaltman, a professor at Harvard Business School who spent decades studying consumer decision-making, arrived at the 95% figure through converging evidence from cognitive psychology, neuroscience, and behavioral economics. The conscious mind, Zaltman demonstrated, processes approximately 40 to 50 bits of information per second. The unconscious mind processes approximately 11 million bits per second. The ratio is not close. The conscious mind is a candle. The unconscious mind is the sun, and the candle believes it is illuminating the room. This finding is not new. Sigmund Freud proposed the existence of the unconscious mind in the 1890s, arguing that the conscious self is the tip of an iceberg, with the vast bulk of mental activity occurring below the waterline, invisible and inaccessible to ordinary awareness. Freud's metaphor has become so familiar that it has lost its power to shock. But the shock is deserved, because Freud was not merely proposing that some mental activity is unconscious. He was proposing that most mental activity is unconscious, that the conscious self is a thin veneer over a deep, powerful, autonomous system that has its own goals, its own logic, and its own agenda. And the century of research that followed Freud has confirmed his central insight while overturning many of his specific theories. The unconscious is real. It is vast. It is powerful. And it is running your life. The modern science of the unconscious begins not with Freud, but with Benjamin Libet, whose experiment we encountered in our investigation of free will. Libet demonstrated that the brain initiates actions approximately half a second before the conscious mind becomes aware of the decision to act. The readiness potential, the electrical buildup in the motor cortex that precedes voluntary movement, begins before consciousness arrives. The decision is made in the dark. The conscious mind is notified after the fact, and John Dylan Haynes extended this finding to 7 seconds, 7 full seconds of unconscious brain activity, detectable by fMRI pattern classifiers, preceding the conscious experience of choosing which button to press. In the free will investigation, we focused on what these findings mean for the question of whether you are free. Now we examine them from a different angle, what they reveal about the unconscious mind that is making decisions on your behalf. Because the Libet and Haynes experiments do not merely show that consciousness arrives late, they show that something arrives early. Something in the brain is evaluating options, weighing alternatives, committing to a course of action, all before the conscious mind has any awareness that a decision is underway. That something is the unconscious, and it is not merely fast, it is sophisticated. It is not merely automatic. It is intelligent. But the unconscious does not merely decide before you do. It perceives before you do. Subliminal perception, the processing of sensory information below the threshold of conscious awareness, has been demonstrated in hundreds of experiments since the 1950s. Arne Ehrman, at the Karolinska Institute in Sweden, showed that subliminal images of angry faces presented for just 30 milliseconds, too briefly for conscious recognition, activate the amygdala and produce measurable physiological stress responses. the person does not see the face. The person is not aware that an image was presented, but the body responds, heart rate increases, skin conductance rises. The fear program activates all in response to a stimulus that consciousness never registered. The unconscious saw the face. The unconscious evaluated the threat. The unconscious triggered the fear response. And consciousness was not informed. Stanislas Dehaene, a neuroscientist at the Collège de France and one of the world's leading researchers on consciousness, has mapped the neural architecture of subliminal processing with fMRI and electrophysiology. Dehaene demonstrated that subliminal stimuli activate the same brain regions as conscious stimuli: visual cortex, fusiform face area, semantic processing networks, but without activating the frontoparietal network that Dehaene calls the global neuronal workspace. The network he identifies with conscious awareness. The processing is real. The neural activity is real. The meaning extraction is real. But the conscious experience is absent. The brain is doing its work perceiving, categorizing, evaluating, responding, and consciousness does not know. Dehaene's framework suggests that consciousness is like a spotlight, illuminating a tiny fraction of the brain's activity, while the vast majority of processing occurs in the dark. In the regions outside the spotlight's beam, in the unconscious systems that the global workspace cannot reach, the unconscious even processes language subliminally. In 2014, a team led by Simon van Gaal at the University of Amsterdam presented negation words not subliminally before showing participants a target word. The subliminal negation reversed the participants' semantic priming, demonstrating that the unconscious mind had not merely detected the word but passed its grammatical function and applied it to subsequent processing. The unconscious mind was doing grammar processing syntax, applying logical operators, modifying semantic representations without any conscious awareness that language was being processed at all. John Bargh, a social psychologist at Yale University, has spent 3 decades demonstrating the unconscious mind's influence on behavior with experiments that are as elegant as they are unsettling. In his most famous study, published in 1996, participants were asked to unscramble sentences that contained words related to elderly stereotypes: Florida, forgetful, wrinkle, grey, bingo. The task appeared to be a simple language exercise, but the real experiment happened after the task was complete. When participants left the laboratory and walked down the hallway to the elevator, they walked more slowly than participants who had unscrambled sentences with neutral words. The elderly-related words had activated unconscious associations with old age, and the associations had altered the participants' physical behavior without their awareness. The participants did not know they were walking slowly. They did not intend to walk slowly. They were not thinking about old age. The unconscious mind had received the prime, processed it below the threshold of awareness, and translated it into motor behavior, all without consulting consciousness. Bargh's subsequent research extended this finding across virtually every domain of human behavior. Unconscious primes affect how much you eat, how much you tip, how aggressively you negotiate, how warmly you evaluate strangers, how creatively you solve problems, and how honestly you behave. In one study, participants who briefly held a warm cup of coffee rated a stranger as having a warmer personality than participants who held a cold cup. The physical warmth activated unconscious associations with interpersonal warmth, and the associations shaped social judgment. In another study, participants who sat in a hard chair were harder negotiators than participants who sat in a soft chair. The physical hardness activated unconscious associations with toughness, and the associations shaped negotiating behavior. The conscious mind had no idea any of this was happening. It experienced its judgments and decisions as free, rational, and self-generated. but the judgments were being shaped by unconscious processes that the conscious mind could not see, could not access, and could not override. Dijksterhuis, a psychologist at Radboud University in the Netherlands, made the case for unconscious intelligence even more forcefully. In a series of studies on what he called unconscious thought theory, Dijksterhuis demonstrated that complex decisions involving multiple variables, trade-offs, and competing criteria are actually made better by the unconscious mind than by the conscious mind. In his experimental paradigm, participants were presented with information about several options: apartments to rent, cars to buy, candidates to hire. One group was asked to think carefully about the options for several minutes before choosing. Another group was distracted given a demanding cognitive task that prevented them from consciously deliberating and then asked to choose. The distracted group consistently made better decisions. Their choices better reflected the objective quality of the options. Their integration of multiple criteria was more accurate. Their decisions were, by measurable standards, more rational. Dijksterhuis's explanation: the unconscious mind has greater processing capacity than the conscious mind. It can weigh more variables simultaneously. It can integrate more information. It can detect patterns that the conscious mind, with its limited bandwidth of 40 bits per second, cannot perceive. The conscious mind is good at focused, rule-based, sequential processing, arithmetic, logic, grammar. The unconscious mind is good at holistic, integrative, parallel processing, pattern recognition, emotional evaluation, complex judgment. And for the kinds of decisions that matter most in life, choosing a partner, evaluating a person's character, navigating a social situation, detecting danger, the unconscious mind is not merely adequate, it is superior. The finding has been replicated with variations across multiple domains. Car buyers who were distracted after viewing extensive information about vehicle options chose objectively better cars than those who deliberated carefully. Apartment hunters who slept on it, allowing unconscious processing to work overnight, selected apartments that better matched their stated priorities than those who analyzed the options consciously. And experienced professionals, doctors, firefighters, military commanders consistently report that their best decisions in complex, high-pressure situations were made intuitively, not analytically. They just knew what to do. The knowledge arrived from the unconscious fully formed, immediately actionable, and more reliable than the analytical process that the conscious mind would have produced. Malcolm Gladwell popularized this insight in Blink, but the science behind it is far more rigorous and far more unsettling than the popular account suggests. It is not merely that intuition is sometimes useful, it is that for complex decisions involving multiple variables, unconscious processing is systematically more accurate than conscious deliberation. The conscious mind is not just slower, it is worse. It makes more errors. It overweights salient but irrelevant information. It is distracted by the most recent data rather than integrating the full picture. It is, for the kinds of decisions that define human life, an inferior processor. The unconscious mind, vast, parallel, holistic, silent, is the mind that actually runs your life. And it runs it, for the most part, well. Ran Hassin, a psychologist at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, pushed the boundaries further. In a series of studies published between 2009 and 2015, Hassin demonstrated that the unconscious mind can perform cognitive operations that were previously thought to require consciousness. Unconscious arithmetic. Participants solved multi-step arithmetic problems, not simple additions, but complex expressions like 9 to 3 minus 4, presented subliminally, below the threshold of conscious perception, and their unconscious solutions influenced their subsequent judgments about the magnitude of visually presented numbers. The unconscious mind was doing math parsing, computing, arriving at correct answers without the conscious mind's knowledge or participation. Unconscious reading. Hebrew-speaking participants processed the meaning of sentences, presented subliminally sentences with specific semantic content, specific syntactic structure, specific meaning, and showed semantic priming effects that required not just word recognition, but grammatical parsing and comprehension. The unconscious mind was reading, not just detecting individual words, but understanding sentences, processing syntax, extracting meaning from structured language without consciousness. Unconscious decision-making. Participants made value-based choices about subliminally presented options, choosing between options they had never consciously seen, based on value assessments they had never consciously made, and their choices reflected the objective value of the options. The unconscious mind was deciding, evaluating, comparing, selecting with accuracy that matched or exceeded conscious deliberation. Hassan's conclusion was radical. Consciousness may not be necessary for any specific cognitive function. Every function that has been attributed to consciousness, perception, attention, memory, language, decision-making, even reasoning, has been demonstrated, at least in simplified form, to operate unconsciously. The question is no longer, what can the unconscious mind do? The question is, what, if anything, requires consciousness? And this question, the question of what consciousness adds that the unconscious cannot provide, is the deepest question in the science of the mind. It connects directly to our investigation of AI and consciousness, where we found that consciousness may be something that transcends computation. The unconscious mind computes, it processes, it decides. But does it experience? Does it feel? Is there something it is like to be the unconscious mind? Or is the unconscious mind like the AI systems we examined, a processor without a perceiver, a computer without a consciousness? The traditions, as we will see, have an answer. And their answer is more nuanced than either the neuroscientists or the philosophers have imagined. The unconscious mind is not merely cognitive, it is biological. It runs the body. Every heartbeat, every breath, every digestive contraction, every immune response, every hormonal fluctuation is managed by unconscious systems that operate without conscious awareness or conscious control. The autonomic nervous system, the branch of the nervous system that regulates heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, respiration, and dozens of other functions, is entirely unconscious. You do not decide to beat your heart. You do not choose to digest your food. You do not instruct your immune cells to attack a pathogen. The unconscious biological intelligence handles all of this with a precision and a reliability that conscious control could never match. If you had to consciously manage your heartbeat, if you had to remember to beat, you had to time each contraction, had to coordinate the electrical signals across 4 chambers, you would die within minutes. The unconscious mind keeps you alive every second, without asking, without reporting, without needing your input. But the unconscious is not merely a biological autopilot. It is a repository. It stores everything. Every experience you have ever had, every face you have ever seen, every word you have ever heard, every sensation you have ever felt is encoded somewhere in the neural networks of the unconscious mind. Most of this information is inaccessible to conscious recall. You cannot remember what you had for breakfast on the 14th of March 2019, but the information is there encoded in synaptic weights, in neural connectivity patterns, in the molecular modifications of the cells that process the experience. Wilder Penfield, a neurosurgeon at the Montreal Neurological Institute, demonstrated this in the 1950s by electrically stimulating the temporal lobes of conscious patients during brain surgery. The stimulation produced vivid, detailed memories of specific conversations, specific songs, specific scenes from childhood that the patients had no conscious access to and could not have recalled without the stimulation. One patient heard a specific orchestra playing a specific piece of music so vividly that she asked whether there was a phonograph in the operating room. Another relived a specific moment from childhood walking through a field, feeling the grass under her feet, hearing the voice of a friend calling from the distance. The memories were not vague, they were cinematically detailed, emotionally vivid, and temporally precise, as though the brain had recorded every moment of experience in full fidelity and stored it in an archive that consciousness could not reach. The case of H.M. Henry Molaison, the most famous patient in the history of neuroscience, revealed the architecture of this archive. In 1953, Molaison underwent surgery to remove his hippocampi, both of them, in an attempt to cure his severe epilepsy. The surgery cured the epilepsy but produced a devastating side effect. Molaison could no longer form new conscious memories. He could not remember people he had met 5 minutes ago. He could not recall what he had eaten for breakfast. He lived in a permanent present, each moment dissolving into nothingness as soon as it passed. And yet, his unconscious memory was intact. He could learn new motor skills, mirror drawing, tracing, puzzle solving, and improve over sessions, even though he had no conscious memory of ever having practiced. His body learned what his mind forgot. His unconscious accumulated experience while his conscious mind reset to zero every few minutes. Brenda Milner, the neuropsychologist who studied Molaison for decades at McGill University, demonstrated that implicit and explicit memory are not merely different types of memory. They are different systems, anatomically separate, neurologically independent, and capable of operating entirely without each other. The hippocampus creates conscious memories. The unconscious memory systems distributed across the amygdala, the cerebellum, the basal ganglia, the cortex, create and maintain implicit memories without the hippocampus, without consciousness, without any contribution from the system that produces the experience of remembering. You have two memory archives. One is conscious, limited, and fragile. The other is unconscious, vast, and virtually indestructible. The memories were there. They were complete. They were detailed. And they were unconscious, stored in the brain's vast, silent archive, inaccessible to the narrow beam of conscious awareness, but available, in principle, to the unconscious systems that manage the brain's information. Eric Kandel, who won the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 2000, for his work on the molecular basis of memory, distinguished between explicit memory, conscious, declarative, accessible to verbal report, and implicit memory, unconscious, procedural, expressed through behavior rather than through words. Implicit memory includes skills, riding a bicycle, playing a musical instrument, conditioned responses, flinching at a sound that was once paired with pain, and emotional associations, feeling anxious in a room that resembles a place where something bad once happened. These memories are not stored in the hippocampus, the brain region responsible for conscious recall. They are stored in the amygdala, the cerebellum, the basal ganglia, and the cortex, distributed across multiple brain systems, operating below the threshold of awareness, shaping behavior without the person's knowledge. The power of implicit memory was demonstrated with devastating clarity by Edouard Claparède, a Swiss neurologist working in the early 20th century. Claparède had a patient with severe amnesia. She could not form new conscious memories. Every time Claparède entered her room, he had to introduce himself, because she had no memory of ever meeting him before. One day, Claparède concealed a pin in his hand and pricked the patient during their handshake. The next day, when he entered her room, the patient did not remember him. She had no conscious memory of the previous meeting, but when he extended his hand for a handshake, she pulled away. She could not explain why. She had no conscious recall of the pin, but her unconscious mind, her implicit memory system, had recorded the association between the handshake and the pain, and it was protecting her from a threat that her conscious mind could not remember. This is the unconscious mind in action. It learns without the person's awareness. It remembers without the person's recall. It protects without the person's understanding. And it does so with a speed and a reliability that conscious processing cannot match. The patient's conscious mind was blank, no memory, no recognition, no understanding of why she was refusing the handshake. Her unconscious mind was operating with perfect accuracy, detecting the threat, activating the avoidance response, keeping her safe. The conscious mind thought it was in charge. The unconscious mind was actually in charge. And the conscious mind did not even know the unconscious mind was there. Antonio Damasio, a neuroscientist at the University of Southern California, extended this insight into the realm of decision-making with his somatic marker hypothesis. Damasio studied patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a brain region that connects emotional processing to decision-making. These patients had intact intelligence, intact memory, and intact reasoning ability. They could analyze options, evaluate evidence, and articulate logical arguments, but they could not make good decisions. They would deliberate endlessly, choose options that were clearly disadvantageous, repeat the same mistakes over and over, and ruin their finances, their relationships, and their careers despite being fully capable of explaining, in abstract terms, what the right decision would be. Damasio's explanation: the patients had lost access to their somatic markers, the unconscious emotional signals that the body generates in response to anticipated outcomes. When a healthy person considers a decision, the body generates a gut feeling, a subtle physiological response below the threshold of awareness that signals whether the anticipated outcome is positive or negative. The heart rate changes slightly, the skin conductance shifts, the muscles tense or relax. These somatic markers, these unconscious bodily signals, guide decision-making by biasing attention toward good options and away from bad ones. The conscious mind experiences this as intuition or gut feeling. The unconscious mind experiences it as the body's wisdom, the accumulated learning of a lifetime of experience encoded in the neural connections between the emotional brain and the body, expressed through the language of physiology rather than the language of words. Damasio demonstrated the somatic markers using the Iowa gambling task, a card game in which participants draw from 4 decks, 2 of which produce large gains but larger losses disadvantageous, and 2 of which produce small gains but smaller losses advantageous. Healthy participants begin choosing from the advantageous decks long before they can consciously explain which decks are better. Their skin conductance shows anticipatory stress responses when their hand reaches toward a disadvantageous deck, responses that begin approximately 40 trials before the participants can articulate any conscious understanding of the deck structure. The body knows before the mind knows. The unconscious evaluates before consciousness reports. And the evaluation is accurate. The somatic markers guide the participants toward the correct choice, even though the conscious mind has not yet figured out what is going on. The implications for the fear investigation we just completed are immediate. The chronic fears that the amygdala generates, the anxieties, the dreads, the free-floating unease, are not produced by conscious deliberation. They are produced by implicit memories, unconscious records of past threats, past dangers, past experiences of loss and harm that activate automatically below the threshold of awareness and trigger the fear response before consciousness has any opportunity to evaluate whether the current situation actually warrants fear. The epigenetic fears that Dijksterhuis and Ressler documented, the mouse pups that feared a smell their fathers had been conditioned to fear, are implicit memories transmitted through the germline. The fears you carry that are not yours, the inherited anxieties of your ancestors, are stored in your unconscious as implicit memories, expressed through your stress biology, shaping your behavior and your physiology without your knowledge or consent. And then, there is the question that takes the investigation beyond conventional neuroscience and into territory that only the traditions and the quantum physics can navigate. If the unconscious mind processes 11 million bits per second, if it stores every experience, runs the body's biology, makes better complex decisions than consciousness, and shapes behavior through mechanisms that consciousness cannot detect, where does it get its information? The conventional answer is from the senses, from the eyes, the ears, the nose, the tongue, the skin. The unconscious processes sensory input faster and more extensively than consciousness. But the conventional answer does not account for all the data. It does not account for the dreams that anticipate future events. The precognitive dreams documented in the information leakage investigation. It does not account for the gut feelings that prove accurate, the intuitions that bypass sensory evidence and arrive at conclusions that later turn out to be correct. It does not account for the mother who wakes at 3 a.m. with the certain knowledge that her child, hundreds of miles away, is in danger, and discovers the next day that the child was in an accident at 3 a.m. It does not account for the Global Consciousness Project's random event generators, devices with no sensory apparatus that correlate with events of mass human attention. The unconscious mind appears to have access to information that the senses do not provide. Information from the future, information from distant locations, information from sources that transcend the boundaries of the individual body. This is where Carl Jung's concept of the collective unconscious becomes essential, and where the investigation takes its most consequential turn. Because Jung proposed that the unconscious mind has 2 layers. The personal unconscious, the repository of individual experiences, repressed memories, and forgotten information, is the layer that Freud described. But beneath the personal unconscious, Jung argued, there is a deeper layer, the collective unconscious that is shared by all human beings. The collective unconscious contains not personal memories but archetypes, universal patterns, primordial images, structural templates of human experience that are not learned from culture but inherited through the species. The archetype of the mother, the archetype of the hero, the archetype of death and rebirth, the archetype of the shadow, the dark, rejected, denied aspects of the self. These archetypes are not ideas, they are not concepts, they are structures of psychic energy that shape perception, drive behavior, and generate the mythological, religious, and artistic expressions that are remarkably similar across cultures that had no contact with each other. Jung's collective unconscious has been dismissed by mainstream psychology as unfalsifiable and unscientific, but the concept has a structural parallel that physics takes very seriously, and that parallel is David Bohm's implicate order. The implicate order is the deeper level of reality from which the explicate order unfolds. It contains all information. It is non-local, not bounded by space. It is atemporal, not bounded by time. And it is accessible, in principle, to any system that can access the quantum field from which it unfolds. Jung's collective unconscious contains all archetypal patterns. It is non-local, shared by all humans, not bounded by individual brains. It is atemporal, containing patterns that are not products of individual experience, but structures that have existed as long as the human species. And it is accessible, Jung argued, through dreams, through meditation, through active imagination. and through the synchronistic events that we explored in our investigation of meaningful coincidence. The parallel between Jung and Bohm is not accidental. It is the product of a direct intellectual exchange, the decades-long correspondence between Jung and Wolfgang Pauli, one of the founders of quantum mechanics and a Nobel laureate in physics. Their collaboration, which we explored in the synchronicity investigation, produced the 1952 book, The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche, in which Jung laid out the concept of synchronicity. Pauli argued that the boundaries between physics and psychology are not as solid as either discipline assumes. Pauli and Jung spent years exploring the relationship between the unconscious mind and the quantum world. Pauli's own unconscious provided the material. He brought his dreams to Jung for analysis, and the dreams were filled with mathematical symbols, physical imagery, and archetypal patterns that fascinated both men. Pauli dreamed of clocks, of quaternities, of mandalas, of the number 4 images that Jung recognized as archetypal symbols of wholeness, and that Pauli recognized as structural features of quantum mechanics. The unconscious mind of one of the greatest physicists in history was generating images that bridged physics and psychology, images that emerged from the collective unconscious and that pointed toward a reality deeper than either discipline could describe alone. Pauli believed that quantum mechanics and depth psychology were describing the same reality from different perspectives, that the acausal connections of quantum entanglement and the acausal connections of synchronicity were manifestations of a single underlying principle. He called this principle the psychophysical unity, a level of reality deeper than either physics or psychology, from which both the physical world and the psychological world emerge as complementary aspects of a single whole. The unconscious mind, in Pauli's framework, is not merely a psychological phenomenon. It is a psychophysical phenomenon rooted in the same quantum reality that produces entanglement, non-locality, and the observer effect. If Pauli was right, if the collective unconscious and the implicate order are the same thing described in different languages, then the unconscious mind is not merely a repository of personal memories and biological programs. It is a portal, an access point to the deepest level of reality, the level at which all information is enfolded, all events are connected, and the boundaries between individual minds dissolve into a shared field of quantum information. The traditions have been describing this portal for thousands of years. They call it by many names: the heart of hearts, the ground of being, the storehouse consciousness, the divine darkness, the cloud of unknowing. And the next part of this investigation will enter the quantum physics of this portal and examine the possibility that your unconscious mind is not merely processing information from the senses. It is receiving information from the universe. The unconscious mind processes 11 million bits of information per second. The conscious mind processes 40. The unconscious stores every experience, runs the body's biology, makes complex decisions with greater accuracy than conscious deliberation, and shapes behavior through mechanisms that consciousness cannot detect. But where does the unconscious get its information? The conventional answer from the senses is almost certainly incomplete, because the unconscious mind appears to know things that the senses have not provided, things that have not yet happened, things that are happening far away, things that no individual could have learned through personal experience. And the question of where this extrasensory information comes from is the question that transforms the science of the unconscious from a branch of psychology into a branch of physics. The evidence for extrasensory, unconscious processing is not anecdotal, it is experimental. We documented it extensively in our investigation of the Hart-McCraty's prestimulus experiments at HeartMath, in which the heart and the brain show measurable physiological responses to emotionally significant stimuli before the stimuli are randomly selected and presented. The heart responds to the future, not consciously. The participants have no conscious awareness that anything has happened. The response is unconscious. It is a shift in heart rate variability, a change in skin conductance, a modulation of brain wave activity, all occurring in response to a stimulus that has not yet been chosen, let alone presented. The unconscious mind is processing information from the future. Bohm, a social psychologist at Cornell University, published 9 experiments in 2011 demonstrating what he called feeling the future. In one experiment, participants were shown 2 curtains on a computer screen and asked to guess which one concealed an image. The computer randomly selected the image location after the participant made their choice. Participants performed at chance for neutral images 50%, exactly as expected. But for emotionally arousing images, erotic or threatening participants chose correctly approximately 53% of the time, a small effect, but statistically significant across over 1,000 trials, and significant in a deeper sense. The participants' unconscious minds were responding to the emotional charge of an image that had not yet been selected. The future was reaching backward into the present, and the unconscious was receiving the signal. The Global Consciousness Project, directed by Roger Nelson at Princeton, has been running continuously since 1998. The project maintains a network of random event generators, electronic devices that produce random sequences of ones and zeros distributed across dozens of locations around the world. The generators are physically isolated. They have no sensory apparatus. They receive no input from human beings. And yet, during events of mass human attention, the September 11 attacks, the Indian Ocean tsunami, the death of Pope John Paul II, New Year's Eve celebrations, the outputs of the generators deviate from randomness. The deviations are small but consistent. They appear before, during, and after the events, and they correlate with the intensity of global emotional response, not with the physical magnitude of the event. The Global Consciousness Project does not prove that the unconscious mind has access to non-local information, but it suggests that consciousness, or something correlated with consciousness, interacts with physical systems in ways that transcend the boundaries of individual brains. The generators are not connected to human beings. They are connected to the same physical reality that human beings inhabit. And when human consciousness is intensely focused, when millions of minds attend to the same event simultaneously, something in the fabric of physical reality shifts. The random becomes less random. The noise acquires a signal, and the signal correlates with the content of human awareness. This is the territory where physics and psychology converge, and where David Bohm's implicate order provides the framework that neither discipline can provide. Alone, Bohm proposed that the reality we observe, the explicate order, is a surface phenomenon. It unfolds from a deeper level of reality, the implicate order in which everything is enfolded into everything else. In the implicate order, there are no separate objects. There are no isolated events. There are no boundaries between here and there, between now and then, between this mind and that mind. Everything is connected to everything. Every event contains information about every other event, and the explicate order, the world of separate objects, distinct events, and individual minds, is a projection from this deeper unity, like a hologram projected from a holographic plate. Bohm developed this framework through a specific analogy that illuminates its relevance to the unconscious mind. Consider a drop of ink placed in a cylinder of glycerine. When the cylinder is rotated, the ink drop smears out and disappears enfolded into the glycerine until it is invisible. But when the cylinder is rotated in the reverse direction, the ink drop re-emerges, unfolding from the glycerine back into its original form. The information was never lost. It was enfolded, hidden in the structure of the medium, invisible to ordinary observation but entirely present, entirely recoverable, entirely intact. The implicate order is like the glycerine after the rotation. Everything is enfolded, everything appears to have disappeared. But everything is still there, stored in the deep structure of reality, accessible to any process that can unfold it. The unconscious mind, in this analogy, is the process that unfolds the enfolded. It accesses information that is hidden from conscious observation, information that is enfolded in the implicate order, invisible to the senses, inaccessible to the 40-bit per second bandwidth of conscious awareness, but available to the 11 million bit per second processing capacity of the unconscious. The conscious mind sees the glycerine and perceives emptiness. The unconscious mind perceives the enfolded ink, the hidden information, the concealed pattern, the invisible structure that contains everything that has ever happened and everything that ever will. The implicate order is not a metaphysical speculation. It is a mathematical framework that Bohm developed to interpret quantum mechanics, specifically to explain the non-local correlations that Bell's theorem proves and that the Aspect and Delft experiments have confirmed. When two entangled particles are measured, they show correlated results regardless of the distance between them instantaneously, without any signal passing between them, in violation of the classical expectation that influences must travel at or below the speed of light. Bohm's explanation: the particles are not separate, they are projections of a single reality in the implicate order. Their correlation is not transmitted from one to the other. Their correlation is a feature of the deeper unity from which both emerge. Now apply this to the unconscious mind. If the implicate order is real, if there exists a deeper level of reality in which all information is enfolded and all events are connected, then the unconscious mind's access to extrasensory information is not a violation of physics. It is a feature of physics. The unconscious mind does not need to receive information from the future through a signal that travels backward in time. It needs only to access the implicate order, the level of reality in which past, present, and future are enfolded into a single whole. The information is already there. It has always been there. The question is not how the information arrives. The question is how the unconscious mind accesses it. And this is where the connection to Carl Jung becomes precise. Jung's collective unconscious is a psychological description of the implicate order. The collective unconscious contains archetypal patterns, universal structures of human experience that are not learned from culture but inherited through the species. The mother archetype, the hero archetype, the shadow, the anima and animus, the self, the archetype of wholeness, of the unified totality that transcends the ego's limited perspective. These archetypes are not ideas. They are structures of psychic energy patterns that organize experience, generate symbols, and produce the mythological, religious, and artistic expressions that are remarkably similar across cultures that had no contact with each other. The flood myth appears in Mesopotamia, in the Hebrew Bible, in Hindu scripture, in Chinese mythology, in Native American traditions, in Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime narratives. The dying and rising god appears in Osiris, in Dionysus, in Christ, in Attis, in Balder. The world tree appears in Norse mythology, Yggdrasil, in Mayan cosmology, Yaxche, in Hindu cosmology, Ashvatha, in Kabbalah, the tree of life. The mandala, the circular symbol of wholeness, appears in Tibetan Buddhism, in Hindu yantra, in Navajo sand paintings, in Gothic cathedral rose windows, in Pauli's dreams. These are not cultural borrowings. They are independent expressions of the same archetypal structure emerging from the collective unconscious of peoples who had no historical connection, no shared scripture, no common cultural ancestor. Jung argued that the archetypes are not stored in the brain. They are not encoded in DNA, although Jung sometimes speculated about biological inheritance, and modern epigenetics has provided a partial mechanism that Jung could not have anticipated. They are patterns in the collective unconscious, a transpersonal, transtemporal layer of psychic reality that individual minds access but do not create. The archetypes are not ideas that someone thought up and that spread through cultural contact. They are structures, structural patterns of psychic energy that organize experience the way a magnetic field organizes iron filings. The iron filings do not create the magnetic field, they reveal it. And the myths, the religions, the art, the dreams that express the archetypes do not create the archetypes, they reveal them. The evidence for the transcultural nature of archetypes is overwhelming. The hero's journey, the narrative pattern identified by Joseph Campbell in The Hero with 1,000 Faces, appears in virtually every culture. Departure from the ordinary world, initiation through trials and encounters with supernatural forces, return with a boon that transforms the community. Gilgamesh follows it, Odysseus follows it, the Buddha follows it, Christ follows it, Arjuna follows it, Luke Skywalker follows it. The pattern is not learned. It is recognized as though the human psyche contains a template for the hero's journey that individual cultures express in their own idiom, but that no culture invented. The serpent symbol appears in every tradition, as the Kundalini in Hinduism, as the caduceus in Greek medicine, as the bronze serpent that Moses raised in the desert, as the Naga in Buddhism, as the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, as the rainbow serpent in Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime. The serpent represents transformation, healing, wisdom, danger, and the boundary between life and death across cultures that had no contact with each other, across millennia that provide no mechanism for cultural transmission. Something in the human psyche generates the serpent symbol, and that something is not cultural. It is structural. It is archetypal. It is, in Jung's language, a feature of the collective unconscious. And this is precisely what Bohm's implicate order describes: a transpersonal, transtemporal layer of physical reality that individual systems access but do not create. The mathematical structure of the implicate order and the phenomenological structure of the collective unconscious are isomorphic. They have the same shape, the same logic, the same relationship to the surface reality that emerges from them. The Pauli-Jung collaboration made this isomorphism explicit. Wolfgang Pauli, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1945 for discovering the exclusion principle, was not merely a physicist with a casual interest in psychology. He was Jung's patient. He underwent analysis with one of Jung's associates for years. He brought hundreds of dreams to Jung for interpretation, and the dreams of one of the greatest minds in 20th century physics were filled with images that bridged the two disciplines. Pauli dreamed of the number 4, the quaternion, the fourfold structure that appears in quantum mechanics as the 4 quantum numbers and in Jungian psychology as the 4 functions: thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition. He dreamed of the world clock, a complex mandala-like image that Jung interpreted as a symbol of the self, and that Pauli interpreted as a symbol of the mathematical structure underlying physical reality. He dreamed of mirrors, of reflections, of symmetries, images that map directly onto the parity operations and symmetry principles that Pauli helped discover in physics. The dreams were not random. They were not the meaningless byproducts of neural noise during sleep. They were communications from the unconscious, from the layer of reality that Bohm would later call the implicate order and that Jung called the collective unconscious. And the communications were carrying information that was relevant to both physics and psychology, information about the deep structure of reality that transcends the boundaries of either discipline. Henry Stapp's quantum framework adds a mechanistic dimension to the Bohm-Jung picture. In Stapp's formulation, The unconscious brain generates quantum superpositions of possible neural states, multiple templates, multiple options, multiple possible thoughts and actions existing simultaneously in a state of quantum indeterminacy. Consciousness through process 1. The choice of measurement selects among these templates. It collapses the superposition into a definite state. It chooses which thought to think, which action to take, which template to stabilize. But what generates the templates? What produces the superposition from which consciousness selects? The answer, in Stapp's framework, is the unconscious mind. The unconscious is the generator. It produces the quantum superposition of possibilities. It offers the menu from which consciousness orders, and the quality of the menu, the range of options, the creativity of the alternatives, the depth of the possibilities depends on the quality of the unconscious mind's processing. A narrow, fearful, conditioned unconscious generates a narrow menu, a few habitual responses, a few well-worn templates, a few predictable options. A broad, open, receptive unconscious generates a rich menu, creative solutions, unexpected possibilities, novel combinations that the conscious mind would never have produced on its own. This framework resolves a puzzle that has haunted the philosophy of mind since Descartes. If consciousness is the decision maker, what produces the decisions from which consciousness chooses? The conscious mind does not create options from nothing. It selects from options that are presented to it, options that arrive, often unbidden, from below the threshold of awareness. The creative insight that appears out of nowhere. The intuition that guides a decision before the reasons can be articulated. The dream that presents a solution to a problem the waking mind could not solve. These are the unconscious mind's offerings, quantum templates generated by the 11 million bit per second processor and presented to the 40 bit per second consciousness for selection. The quality of the offerings depends on the depth of the unconscious mind's access. If the unconscious is limited to personal memories and sensory data, the offerings will be limited recombinations of past experience, variations on familiar themes. But if the unconscious has access to the implicate order, to the collective unconscious, to the quantum vacuum, to information sources that transcend individual experience, then the offerings can be extraordinary. They can include insights that the individual has never encountered, patterns that no culture has articulated, connections between domains that no education has linked. The genius of Mozart, the visions of Blake, the equations of Ramanujan, the Indian mathematician, who claimed that his theorems were revealed to him in dreams by the goddess Namagiri, may be examples of what happens when the unconscious mind's access to the implicate order is unusually deep and the creative offerings are unusually rich. This is the quantum relationship between the conscious and unconscious minds. The unconscious generates possibilities. Consciousness selects among them. The unconscious is the wave function, the field of superposed alternatives, the quantum potential from which actuality emerges. Consciousness is the measurement, the collapse, the selection, the determination of which possibility becomes actual. Without the unconscious, consciousness has nothing to select from, no alternatives, no possibilities, no menu. Without consciousness, the unconscious has no mechanism for actualizing its possibilities, no measurement, no collapse, no determination of outcomes. They need each other, they complete each other. And the quality of a person's life depends both on the richness of the unconscious possibilities and on the wisdom of the conscious selections. Now consider what this means for the tradition's practices of meditation, prayer, and contemplation. These practices do not merely calm the mind, they do not merely reduce stress, they expand the unconscious menu. Meditation, by quieting the conscious mind's compulsive chatter, allows the unconscious to generate a wider range of templates. The meditator who sits in silence for 30 minutes is not doing nothing. They are allowing the unconscious mind to process, to integrate, to generate possibilities that the busy conscious mind normally suppresses. Neuroscience confirms this. Judson Brewer at Brown University has demonstrated using fMRI that experienced meditators show reduced activity in the default mode network's self-referential components, the parts of the brain that generate the internal monologue, the rumination, the compulsive self-talk that occupies most of the conscious mind's bandwidth during waking hours. When this chatter quiets, when the 40-bit per second conscious mind stops consuming its own limited bandwidth with repetitive self-referential processing, the unconscious mind's offerings become audible. The signal emerges from the noise, the creative template that was always being generated by the 11 million bit per second unconscious processor, but that was drowned out by the conscious mind's chatter, becomes perceptible. This is why insights arrive during meditation, during walks, during showers, during the hypnagogic state between waking and sleep. These are all conditions in which the conscious mind's chatter is reduced, and the unconscious mind's offerings, normally masked by the noise of conscious processing, become accessible. The creative insight that arrives after meditation, the solution that comes to you in the shower, during a walk, in the moment of waking, is the unconscious mind's offering. A template that was generated during the quiet period, held in quantum superposition, and presented to consciousness at the moment when consciousness was receptive enough to notice it. Prayer operates similarly, but with a directional component. The person who prays is directing the unconscious mind's processing toward a specific intention, healing, guidance, wisdom, connection with the divine. The prayer sets the parameters. The unconscious mind generates the possibilities within those parameters. And the quality of the possibilities, their depth, their creativity, their relevance to the person's life depends on the quality of the prayer. A shallow, rote, distracted prayer generates shallow possibilities. A deep, focused, heartfelt prayer, the kind of prayer that the Hesychast tradition describes as descending from the mind into the heart, generates profound possibilities. The prayer does not merely ask God for help. It opens the unconscious mind to a wider range of quantum templates that may include information from the implicate order, from the collective unconscious, from sources that the individual mind cannot access through sensory channels alone. Andrew Newberg's neuroimaging studies of prayer and meditation at Thomas Jefferson University support this picture. Intense contemplative practice produces measurable changes in brain activity, reduced parietal lobe activity, softening the boundary between self and world, increased frontal lobe coherence, enhancing focused attention, and altered thalamic gating, changing which signals reach conscious awareness. The brain's filtering systems are reconfigured by deep prayer and meditation, allowing signals that are normally filtered out to reach conscious awareness. The traditions describe this as opening the heart, descending into the depths, entering the cloud of unknowing. The neuroscience describes it as altered thalamic gating and reduced default mode network activity. The language is different. The phenomenon is the same. The conscious mind's filters are loosened, and the unconscious mind's offerings, including, potentially, offerings from the implicate order, become accessible. Dreams are the unconscious mind's most direct communication channel, and the quantum framework illuminates why dreams have been treated as sacred in every tradition. During REM sleep, the conscious mind is offline. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of conscious control, deliberate decision-making, and the rational evaluation that normally filters unconscious content, is deactivated. The default mode network, the brain system associated with self-referential thinking, mind-wandering, and internal simulation, is highly active, and the thalamic gates that normally filter sensory input are closed, allowing internal signals from the unconscious, from the body's memory archives, from sources that the waking mind cannot access to dominate the brain's activity. The neurochemistry of dreams supports this picture. During REM sleep, norepinephrine, the neurotransmitter associated with focused attention and logical thinking, is at its lowest levels. Acetylcholine, the neurotransmitter associated with vivid sensory experience and memory consolidation, is at its highest. And serotonin, which modulates mood and constrains associative thinking, is suppressed. The brain is in a state of maximum associative freedom, connecting ideas, images, and memories that the waking mind keeps separate, generating combinations that the logical mind would reject as absurd, but that the intuitive mind recognizes as meaningful. This is why dreams are creative. This is why they are strange. And this is why they contain information that the waking mind does not possess, because the unconscious mind, freed from the constraints of logical processing and sensory input, can access patterns and connections that the waking mind's filters exclude. This is why dreams contain information that the dreamer did not learn through normal channels. Precognitive dreams, dreams that accurately depict events that have not yet occurred, have been documented throughout history and across every culture. Abraham Lincoln dreamed of his own assassination days before it happened. Mark Twain dreamed of his brother's death in a steamboat explosion before the accident occurred. The psychiatrist Ian Stevenson collected thousands of cases of precognitive dreams and published them in peer-reviewed journals, documenting statistical patterns that are difficult to explain by coincidence alone. And the HeartMath prestimulus research, which we explored in the Heart series, provides a physiological mechanism. The body responds to future events before they occur. If the body can access future information during waking states, as the prestimulus research suggests, then the unconscious mind's access to future information during sleep, when the conscious mind's filters are removed, should be even greater. The information leakage investigation explored this in detail, examining the evidence that dreams function as a channel through which information from the implicate order leaks into conscious awareness. The key finding was that the information does not arrive as explicit, propositional knowledge. Event X will occur at time Y. It arrives as imagery, as metaphor, as symbolism, as narrative, the language of the unconscious mind, which communicates not through words but through patterns. The dreamer does not receive a news report about the future. The dreamer receives an image, a ship sinking, a building collapsing, a loved one in distress that corresponds, metaphorically and emotionally, to a future event. The unconscious mind has accessed the information, but it translates the information into its own language before passing it to consciousness. And that language, the language of symbols, archetypes, and emotional resonance, is the language that the traditions have been studying, interpreting, and cultivating for thousands of years. There is one more dimension of the quantum unconscious that must be examined before we turn to the traditions, and it concerns the relationship between the individual unconscious and the void, quantum vacuum. The quantum vacuum, the lowest energy state of the quantum field, is not empty. It is the most information-rich entity in physics. It contains zero-point fluctuations, electromagnetic oscillations that persist even at absolute zero when all thermal energy has been removed. It contains virtual particles, particle-antiparticle pairs that flash into and out of existence continuously, borrowing energy from the vacuum for durations too brief to measure individually, but whose collective effects are measurable and confirmed. And it contains, if the holographic principle is correct, all the information about the entire universe, encoded on the boundary of observable space-time. Edgar Mitchell, the Apollo 14 astronaut and founder of the Institute of Noetic Sciences, proposed what he called the quantum hologram hypothesis. Every object in the universe emits and absorbs quantum holograms, information-carrying patterns in the quantum vacuum that record the object's history and that can be accessed, in principle, by any system capable of resonating with the relevant frequencies. Mitchell proposed that the brain, specifically the microtubule network within neurons, functions as a quantum holographic receiver, accessing information stored in the quantum vacuum through resonance rather than through sensory channels. Mitchell's hypothesis is speculative. It has not been experimentally confirmed, but it provides a mechanism for the extrasensory information processing that the unconscious mind appears to perform. The unconscious mind does not receive information from the future through a signal. It accesses information from the quantum vacuum, the holographic record of all events, past, present, and future, through quantum resonance. The microtubules in the neurons, the same structures that Penrose and Hameroff identified as the seat of consciousness, serve as the antenna, and the unconscious mind, which processes 11 million bits per second, which has no conscious filters, which operates in the quantum regime where the implicate order is accessible, is the receiver. If this picture is correct, and it must be clearly marked as speculative, as a hypothesis rather than an established conclusion, then the unconscious mind is not merely a repository of personal memories and biological programs. It is not merely a fast processor that handles the tasks that consciousness is too slow to manage. It is an interface between the individual and the universe, a portal through which the information of the implicate order, the quantum hologram of all events, all patterns, all possibilities, flows into the individual mind. And the traditions which have been describing this portal for thousands of years, which have developed sophisticated technologies for accessing it, which have named it and mapped it and prescribed practices for opening it, may have been describing a real phenomenon, a phenomenon that psychology cannot explain, a phenomenon that classical physics cannot accommodate, but a phenomenon that quantum mechanics, with its non-locality, its entanglement, its implicate order, and its quantum vacuum can, at least in principle, describe. The next part of this investigation will enter the traditions and hear their descriptions of this portal, because while the physics provides the framework and the psychology provides the evidence, the traditions provide the map. And the map, as we will see, is far more detailed, far more practical, and far more consistent across cultures than anyone who dismisses the traditions as pre-scientific superstition would expect. The traditions did not discover the unconscious mind in the 20th century. They discovered it at the beginning, before Freud, before Jung, before neuroscience existed as a discipline. They discovered it through the only instrument available to them: sustained, systematic, disciplined introspection conducted over decades of contemplative practice. And the maps they drew, the maps of the mind's hidden architecture, its layered structure, its relationship to a reality deeper than individual experience, are more detailed, more sophisticated, and more consistent across cultures than any map that modern psychology has produced. The traditions did not merely intuit that the unconscious exists. They explored it, they mapped it, they named its layers, they identified its contents, they developed technologies for accessing it, and they warned with a unanimity that transcends their differences on every other question, that the unconscious mind is not merely a repository of repressed memories and biological programs. It is a doorway, a portal to a level of reality that the conscious mind cannot reach on its own. Buddhism provides the most detailed and systematic map of the unconscious mind in any tradition, and the map was drawn 25 centuries before Freud. The Yogacara school, which we encountered briefly in our investigation of AI and consciousness, describes 8 levels of consciousness with a precision that modern cognitive science is only beginning to approach. The first 5 consciousnesses are sensory: sight, hearing, smell, taste, and touch. These are the surface of the mind, the instruments through which raw experience enters awareness. The 6th consciousness, mano-vijnana, is the thinking mind, the discursive intellect that processes sensory data, forms concepts, generates language, and produces the stream of thought that most people identify as me. This is what Western psychology calls consciousness, the 40-bit per second processor, the tip of the iceberg, the candle in the cathedral. But beneath the sixth consciousness, beneath the thinking mind, beneath the stream of thought, beneath everything that the ordinary person is aware of, lie two deeper layers that correspond with remarkable precision to the unconscious mind that modern science has documented. The seventh consciousness manners is the self-referential mind. It is the consciousness that takes the eighth consciousness as its object and misperceives it as a permanent, independent self. Manas is the ego not in Freud's technical sense, but in the colloquial sense, the sense of being a separate, enduring I that persists through time, that owns experiences, that fears dissolution. Manas is the source of what psychologists call self-referential processing, the constant, automatic, largely unconscious narration of experience in terms of me and mine. It is the default mode network's psychological correlate, the mental activity that Brewer's fMRI studies show is reduced during meditation. And it is, in the Buddhist analysis, the primary source of suffering because the self that Manas constructs is an illusion, and the fear of losing an illusion produces needless anguish. Manas operates almost entirely below the threshold of conscious awareness. You do not decide to feel like a separate self. You do not choose to experience the world through the lens of me and not me. The self-referential processing is automatic, continuous, and invisible like the operating system running beneath the application you are using. You see the application, the sixth consciousness, the thinking mind. You do not see the operating system manas, the self-constructing process, but the operating system shapes everything the application does. Every thought is colored by self-reference. Every perception is filtered through, how does this affect me? Every decision is weighted by, what do I want? Manas is the unconscious ego, the hidden operator that constructs the illusion of selfhood and then defends it against every perceived threat. The eighth consciousness, alaya vijnana, is the deepest layer, and it corresponds most closely to what modern psychology calls the unconscious mind, while extending far beyond it. The word alaya means storehouse or repository. The alaya vijnana is the storehouse consciousness, the vast, silent archive that contains the seeds beer of all experience. Every action you perform, every thought you think, every word you speak, every choice you make deposits a seed in the alaya vijnana. The seed is not a memory in the conscious sense. It is a dispositional tendency, a karmic imprint that shapes future experience by biasing the mind towards certain perceptions, certain reactions, certain patterns of thought and behavior. The seeds are Candel's implicit memories, not stored as conscious recollections, but expressed as tendencies, as habits, as the automatic, unconscious patterns that shape behavior without the person's knowledge or consent. But the alaya vijnana contains more than personal seeds. It contains what the Yogacara tradition calls vasana, habitual tendencies that have accumulated over lifetimes, across rebirths, through the entire history of the individual's karmic stream. The vasanas are not personal memories. They are structural tendencies, patterns of psychic energy that organize experience in ways that transcend individual biography. They are, in Jungian terms, the archetypes of the personal unconscious extended, through the Buddhist doctrine of rebirth, across a temporal span that makes Jung's collective unconscious seem modest by comparison. Vasubandhu, the 4th century philosopher who systematized the Yogacara teachings, described the alaya vijnana with an image that maps directly onto Bohm's implicate order. The alaya vijnana, Vasubandhu wrote, is like a river. It appears to be a single, continuous entity, but it is actually a constantly flowing stream of momentary events, each arising and passing in dependence upon the previous moment, carrying the seeds of all past experience while continuously giving rise to new experience. The river is never the same from moment to moment, and yet it maintains continuity, identity, and direction. This is the implicate order expressed in psychological language, a flowing, dynamic, self-renewing process that contains all information, that produces all experience, and that cannot be frozen into a static thing without destroying its essential nature. The alaya vijnana is not a container, it is a flow, and the flow contains everything. The Buddhist practice of vipassana insight meditation is designed to access the alaya vijnana directly. The meditator sits in silence and observes not the content of thoughts but the process of their arising. Where does a thought come from? Watch carefully. A thought appears from where? You did not decide to think it. You did not choose its content. It emerged from the alaya vijnana, from the storehouse, from the unconscious depths, and presented itself to the sixth consciousness for processing. The meditator watches this process, the emergence, the presentation, the processing, the dissolution, without intervening, without judging, without adding commentary, simply watching the unconscious mind's offerings arrive at the threshold of consciousness. S.N. Goenka, the 20th century Burmese Indian meditation teacher who brought vipassana to the modern world through a global network of meditation centers, emphasized a specific technique that makes the unconscious tangible: body scanning. The practitioner systematically moves attention through the body, from the crown of the head to the tips of the toes, observing physical sensations with equanimity. The sensations, tingling, warmth, pressure, pain, vibration, are not random. They are the somatic expression of the samskaras and vasanas stored in the alaya vijnana. The unconscious mind expresses itself through the body. Every suppressed emotion, every unprocessed experience, every inherited tendency produces a corresponding physical sensation: a knot of tension in the shoulders, a constriction in the chest, a heaviness in the abdomen. The body scanning practice makes the unconscious visible not through words or images, but through the felt sense of the body's stored information. Goenka taught that, as the practitioner observes these sensations with equanimity, without reacting to them, without craving the pleasant or avoiding the unpleasant, the stored samskaras begin to dissolve. The unconscious patterns, held in the body as physical tension and in the alaya vijnana as karmic seeds, are destabilized by the equanimous observation. This is the quantum Zeno effect in reverse. Instead of stabilizing a pattern through fearful attention, the practitioner destabilizes a pattern through equanimous attention. The observation is different, not grasping, not avoiding, but simply witnessing, and the different quality of observation produces a different quantum result. The pattern decoheres, the samskara dissolves, and the practitioner, freed from one more unconscious compulsion, becomes one step more free. This practice produces an extraordinary perceptual shift. The meditator begins to see directly, experientially, not theoretically, that thoughts are not generated by the conscious self. They are generated by the unconscious, by the alaya vijnana, and delivered to consciousness for observation. The conscious self is not the thinker, it is the witness. It does not produce thoughts, it receives them. And this shift in perception from "I am thinking" to "thoughts are being offered to me by a process I do not control" is precisely the shift that the quantum framework describes. Consciousness is not the generator of neural templates. It is the selector. The unconscious generates. Consciousness observes, selects, and stabilizes. And the meditator who sees this directly, who experiences in their own awareness the arising of thoughts from the unconscious depths, has accessed the border between the conscious and unconscious minds. They have reached the doorway. And the traditions teach that through this doorway lies a reality deeper than either the conscious or the unconscious, a reality that the Buddhists call shunyata, emptiness, the luminous void from which all consciousness arises. Christianity maps the unconscious through a different vocabulary, but the structure it describes is remarkably similar. The Christian tradition does not use the term unconscious. It uses the term the heart, not the physical organ but the spiritual center, the deepest layer of the person, the place where God and the human meet. The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. The prophet Jeremiah wrote, "Who can understand it?" This is a description of the unconscious, a hidden depth within the person that the person cannot access through ordinary means, that contains motives and tendencies that the conscious mind cannot see, and that operates according to a logic that the rational mind cannot comprehend. The Psalms describe God as the one who searches the heart and examines the mind, the one who perceives the unconscious depths that the person cannot perceive. "Search me, O God, and know my heart," the psalmist prays. "Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there is any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." This is not a request for God to observe the conscious mind. The psalmist already knows what is in the conscious mind. It is a request for God to illuminate the unconscious, to reveal the hidden motives, the concealed patterns, the invisible tendencies that the conscious mind cannot access. The prayer assumes that there are parts of the self that are invisible to the self parts that only a deeper awareness can perceive. The prayer is an invitation to the divine to search the unconscious. Paul, whose description of the divided will we explored in the free will investigation, describes a similar experience in his letter to the Corinthians. "I do not even judge myself," Paul writes. "My conscience is clear, but that does not make me innocent. It is the Lord who judges me." The conscious mind, Paul's conscience, reports that everything is fine, but Paul knows that the conscious mind is not a reliable reporter. There are depths within him that his conscience cannot reach, depths that contain motives, tendencies, and patterns that may contradict his conscious self-assessment. Only God, the awareness that penetrates the unconscious, can provide an accurate judgment. The Hesychast tradition, the contemplative tradition of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, developed the most sophisticated Christian technology for accessing the unconscious. The practice builds on a centuries-long lineage of inner observation that begins with the Desert Fathers, the monks who retreated into the Egyptian desert in the 3rd and 4th centuries and developed what may be the earliest systematic phenomenology of the unconscious mind. Evagrius of Pontus, the Desert Father we encountered in the fear investigation, classified the logismoi, the thoughts that arise in the mind. Uninvited, unbidden, and often unwelcome, Evagrius identified 8 categories of logismoi: gluttony, lust, avarice, sadness, anger, acedia, vainglory, and pride. These are not merely sins. They are unconscious patterns, automatic, compulsive, repetitive thought streams that arise from the depths of the mind and capture conscious attention before the person is aware that anything has happened. Evagrius's technology for managing the logismoi antiresis, the practice of countering each unconscious thought pattern with a specific scriptural verse, is a 4th century version of cognitive behavioral therapy, directed not at conscious beliefs but at unconscious compulsions. The Desert Fathers were treating the unconscious mind 15 centuries before Freud named it. The Hesychast practice of the Jesus prayer, the continuous repetition of "Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me," synchronized with the breath and focused in the heart, is designed to carry awareness from the surface of the mind into its depths. The Hesychast masters describe this as the descent of the mind into the heart, a movement from the discursive intellect, the sixth consciousness, in Buddhist terms to the spiritual center, the alaya vijnana, the unconscious depths. The descent is not metaphorical. It is a phenomenological experience. The meditator feels awareness sinking from the head into the chest, from thought into feeling, from the surface into the depth, and in the depth in the heart. In the unconscious, the Hesychast encounters what the tradition calls the uncreated light, the direct experience of divine presence that operates below the threshold of ordinary consciousness. Simeon the New, theologian, the 10th century Byzantine mystic, described the experience of the uncreated light with a precision that anticipates modern phenomenological philosophy. The light, Simeon reported, is not seen with the physical eyes. It is not imagined by the mind. It is perceived by the heart, by the spiritual faculty that operates in the unconscious depths beneath the surface of discursive thought. And the light is not an object of awareness. It is awareness itself, the luminous quality of consciousness that is normally concealed by the content of consciousness, but that becomes visible when the content subsides. This is the Buddhist concept of the luminous nature of mind, the natural radiance of awareness that is perceived when the obscurations of habitual thinking are removed. And it is perceived not by adding something to consciousness, but by subtracting, by removing the surface activity that masks the depth. Gregory Palamas, the 14th century theologian who defended the Hesychast practice against rationalist criticism, argued that the uncreated light is not a product of the imagination. It is not a hallucination. It is not a psychological phenomenon. It is a direct encounter with divine reality, a reality that is always present in the depths of the heart, but that is normally concealed by the surface activity of the conscious mind. The conscious mind's chatter, the 40 bit per second stream of discursive thought, masks the deeper signal. The Hesychast practice quiets the chatter, and when the chatter subsides, when the mind descends into the heart, when the discursive intellect surrenders its dominance, the deeper signal becomes perceptible, the uncreated light, the divine presence, the reality that was always there in the unconscious depths, waiting to be perceived. The Hindu tradition maps the unconscious through the concept of the three bodies, Sthula Sharira, the gross body, the physical form, Sukshma Sharira, the subtle body, the psychological apparatus, and Karana Sharira, the causal body, the deepest layer of the self. The causal body corresponds to what modern psychology calls the unconscious mind, but it extends far beyond it. The Karana Sharira contains the samskaras, the accumulated impressions of all past actions, all past thoughts, all past experiences, not merely from this lifetime, but from all previous lifetimes. The samskaras are the bija of the Buddhist tradition, dispositional seeds that determine the trajectory of the individual's experience, that shape perception, that bias, attention, that produce the habitual patterns of thought and behavior that the person experiences as personality or character. The Karana Sharira is the body that persists through death and rebirth. The gross body dies, the subtle body dissolves, but the causal body, the unconscious archive, the repository of samskaras continues. It carries the accumulated impressions of all experience into the next incarnation, where they unfold as the new personality's innate tendencies, talents, fears, and attractions. This is the Hindu explanation for child prodigies, the 4-year-old who plays piano with the skill of an adult, the child who speaks a language no one in the family speaks, the infant who shows terror at a stimulus that has no basis in the infant's experience. The samskaras from previous lives are expressing themselves through the causal body, the unconscious layer that carries information across the boundary of death. The practice of yoga nidra, yogic sleep, is the Hindu tradition's primary technology for accessing the Karana Sharira. The practitioner lies in a relaxed position and is guided through a systematic withdrawal of awareness from the external senses, through the subtle body, into the causal body. The practitioner remains conscious. This is not sleep, but awareness is directed inward, past the surface of the mind, past the discursive intellect, past the emotions and the self-referential processing, into the deepest layer of the unconscious. In this state, which the tradition describes as a state between waking and sleeping, between the conscious and the unconscious, on the threshold of the causal body, the practitioner can plant a sankalpa, a seed intention, a resolve, a direction that will be received by the unconscious mind and that will unfold over time as a change in behavior, perception, and life circumstances. The sankalpa is the Hindu equivalent of the STAP frameworks. Process 1, a conscious intention that is delivered to the unconscious for processing. But the delivery occurs not through the normal channels of conscious deliberation, but through the deep channel of yoga nidra, the state in which the conscious mind's filters are reduced and the unconscious mind is directly accessible. The sankalpa bypasses the discursive intellect, bypasses the ego's defenses, bypasses the habitual patterns that normally filter and distort conscious intentions, and reaches the causal body, the unconscious depths, where intentions have the greatest power to produce change. The concept of turiya, the fourth state, extends the Hindu map of the unconscious beyond anything that modern psychology has described. The three ordinary states of consciousness are waking, dreaming, and deep sleep. In waking, the conscious mind is active and the unconscious is hidden. In dreaming, the conscious mind is offline and the unconscious generates imagery freely. In deep sleep, both conscious and unconscious activity are minimal. The mind is at rest. But the Mandukya Upanishad describes a fourth state, turiya, that underlies and pervades the other three. Turiya is not a state that alternates with the others. It is the ground of all states, the awareness that is present during waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, the consciousness that witnesses all three states without being identical to any of them. Turiya is the witness consciousness, the awareness that is aware. And the Mandukya Upanishad identifies Turiya with Brahman, the ultimate reality, the ground of all being, the consciousness that is not produced by the brain, but that is the foundation from which all experience, conscious and unconscious, arises. The Islamic tradition maps the unconscious through the concept of the nafs, the self, the ego, the soul in its human dimension. The Quran and the Sufi tradition describe the nafs as having multiple layers, stages of development that represent progressively deeper levels of self-awareness and progressively greater freedom from unconscious compulsion. The lowest stage is nafs al-amara, the commanding self, the self that is entirely driven by unconscious impulses, by desire, by appetite, by the automatic, unreflective urge to satisfy the ego's demands. This is the unconscious mind in its most unrefined form, the amygdala-driven, cortisol-saturated, tunnel-vision self that the fear investigation documented. The person at this stage is not free. They are driven. Their behavior is determined by unconscious forces that they cannot see and cannot control. The intermediate stages, nafs al-lawama, the self-reproaching self, nafs al-mulhima, the inspired self, nafs al-mutmaina, the contented self, represent progressive stages of awakening. At each stage, the person becomes more aware of their unconscious patterns. The self-reproaching self notices its own impulses and feels guilty about them, the beginning of conscious self-observation. The inspired self begins to receive guidance from the deeper layers, intuitions, insights, moments of clarity that arise from beyond the ego's calculations. The contented self achieves a settled peace, the itminan that the Quran describes that is no longer disturbed by the unconscious impulses of the lower stages. The highest stages, nafs al-radiyah, the pleased self, nafs al-madiyah, the pleasing self, and nafs al-safiyah, the purified self, represent the progressive dissolution of the boundary between the conscious and unconscious minds. At these stages, the person is no longer driven by unconscious impulses because the unconscious has been illuminated, not repressed, not controlled, but seen. The contents of the unconscious have been brought into awareness through the practices of dhikr, muraqabah, contemplation, and muhasabah, self-examination. The darkness has been lit, the hidden has been revealed, and the person now, fully transparent to themselves, fully aware of their own depths, fully integrated, acts from a unity of conscious and unconscious that the lower stages cannot achieve. Ghazali, the 11th century theologian, whose insights we have encountered throughout these investigations, described the heart qalb as the organ of this integration. The heart, in Ghazali's framework, is not the conscious mind. It is not the unconscious mind. It is the meeting point, the place where the conscious and the unconscious converge, where the surface and the depth communicate, where the known and the hidden become one. The heart is the portal, and the practices that Ghazali prescribes, dhikr, self-examination, ethical purification, surrender to God, are technologies for opening the portal, for establishing communication between the conscious surface and the unconscious depths, for integrating what Freud divided into id, ego, and superego into a single, unified, transparent self. The Islamic tradition also treats dreams with a seriousness that no other Abrahamic tradition matches. The Prophet Muhammad said, "The dream of a believer is 1/46th part of prophecy." This is a precise fraction, not a vague endorsement, but a specific quantitative claim about the relationship between dreams and divine revelation. Dreams, in the Islamic framework, are a legitimate channel of divine communication, a channel that operates through the unconscious mind, bypassing the conscious intellect's filters, delivering information from a source deeper than sensory experience. The Quran itself describes prophetic dreams: Ibrahim's dream of sacrificing Ismail, Yusuf's dream of 11 stars bowing before him, the Pharaoh's dream of 7 fat cows and 7 lean cows that Yusuf interpreted as divine communications that arrive through the unconscious mind during sleep. Ibn Arabi, the 13th century Andalusian mystic, whose concept of the perfect human we encountered in the AI investigation, developed the most sophisticated Islamic theory of the unconscious through his concept of the barzakh. The barzakh is the isthmus, the intermediate realm between the physical world and the divine world, between the visible and the invisible, between the conscious and the unconscious. The barzakh is where dreams occur in the space between waking and sleeping, between the material and the spiritual, between the individual mind and the divine mind. It is, in Bohm's terms, the interface between the explicate and implicate orders. It is, in Jung's terms, the threshold between the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. And it is accessible, Ibn Arabi taught, not only through dreams but through contemplation, through dhikr, through the practices that quiet the surface mind and allow awareness to descend into the depths. Ibn Arabi described the barzakh as the realm of creative imagination, al-khayal, which is not fantasy but a faculty of perception that operates between the senses and the intellect. The creative imagination perceives realities that are too subtle for the senses and too concrete for the abstract intellect. It perceives in images, in symbols, in living metaphors that carry meaning from the divine world into the human world, This is precisely the language of the unconscious mind, the language of dreams, of archetypes, of the symbols that Jung identified as the collective unconscious's mode of communication. Ibn Arabi's Barzakh and Jung's collective unconscious are describing the same territory, the intermediate realm where the personal meets the universal, where the conscious meets the unconscious, where the human meets the divine. The Islamic tradition developed a sophisticated science of dream interpretation, Ilm al-Tabir, that treats dreams not as meaningless neural noise, but as encrypted messages from the deeper layers of reality, delivered through the unconscious mind's symbolic language. The science has its own hermeneutics rules for interpreting symbols, guidelines for distinguishing true dreams from false ones, criteria for evaluating the spiritual significance of dream content, and the tradition recognizes three categories of dreams. Dreams from the nafs, the ego, producing wish fulfillment and anxiety processing, dreams from shaitan, producing confusion and distress, and dreams from Allah, producing guidance, warning, and revelation. The first two categories correspond to what modern psychology calls the personal unconscious. The third category corresponds to what Jung called the collective unconscious, and what the quantum framework identifies as information from the implicate order. The convergence across traditions is structural, not merely thematic. Every tradition identifies the same architecture: a surface mind, the conscious intellect, and a deep mind, the unconscious, the heart, the alaya vijnana, the karana sharira, the nafs. Every tradition describes the deep mind as containing more information, more power, and more potential than the surface mind. Every tradition develops technologies for accessing the deep mind: meditation, prayer, contemplation, dream work, breath practices, ethical purification, and every tradition identifies the deep mind as connected to a reality larger than the individual, the collective unconscious, the implicate order, the divine ground, Brahman, Allah, the Tao. The unconscious is not merely personal, it is transpersonal. It is the individual's access point to the universal, and the tradition's practices are technologies for opening that access, for widening the channel, deepening the connection, and allowing information from the universal to flow into the individual. The final part of this investigation will put it all together: the neuroscience, the quantum physics, the traditions, and address the question that this entire inquiry has been building toward. Your unconscious mind is not merely controlling your behavior, it is connecting you to the universe. And the practices that the traditions have been prescribing for thousands of years are not merely psychological exercises, they are technologies for opening the door between you and everything. 3 lines of inquiry, 3 independent approaches to the hidden continent within you, and they converge on a picture that is more remarkable, more demanding, and more consequential than any of them could produce alone. The unconscious mind is not merely a faster processor running beneath the surface of awareness. It is an interface between the individual and the universe, a portal through which information from the deepest level of reality flows into the human mind, shapes perception, generates the templates from which consciousness selects, and connects the isolated self to a web of meaning that transcends the boundaries of the individual brain. The neuroscience established the scale, Zoltmann's 95%, the 11 million bits per second that the unconscious processes while consciousness handles 40. Libet's half-second head start and Haynes's 7-second lead the unconscious, deciding before consciousness knows a decision is underway. Bargh's priming effects, demonstrating that unconscious cues shape behavior without awareness. Dijksterhuis's unconscious thought theory, proving that complex decisions are made better by the unconscious than by the conscious mind. Hassin's demonstrations that the unconscious can read, calculate, and decide, performing every cognitive function that was once thought to require consciousness. Damasio's somatic markers, showing that the body knows the right answer before the mind articulates it. Candle's implicit memory systems, storing everything in neural archives that consciousness cannot reach. And Clapeyron's pin, revealing that the unconscious protects you from threats that consciousness has forgotten. The quantum physics provided the framework. Bohm's implicate order, the deeper level of reality in which all information is enfolded, all events are connected, and the boundaries between individual minds dissolve into a unified field. Stapp's Process 1, the conscious selection among quantum templates generated by the unconscious brain, the measurement that collapses possibility into actuality. The Pauli-Jung collaboration, the decades-long dialogue between a Nobel physicist and the founder of analytical psychology, both arriving at the same conclusion: the unconscious mind and the quantum world are aspects of a single psychophysical reality. Mitchell's quantum hologram, the hypothesis that the brain accesses information stored in the quantum vacuum through resonance rather than through sensory channels. And the Global Consciousness Project, the statistical evidence that consciousness interacts with physical systems in ways that transcend the boundaries of individual brains. The traditions provided the map. Buddhism's 8 consciousnesses, the most detailed phenomenological map of the mind's architecture ever produced, with the Alaya Vijnana as the storehouse of all seeds, the flowing repository of all experience, the unconscious depths from which all conscious life arises. Christianity's descent of the mind into the heart, the hesychast technology for moving awareness from the surface to the depth, from the discursive intellect to the spiritual center where the uncreated light dwells. Hinduism's 3 bodies and 4 states, the causal body as the deepest unconscious layer, Turiya as the witness consciousness that underlies all states. Islam's 7 stages of the nafs, the progressive illumination of the unconscious through dhikr, contemplation, and self-examination, and the universal recognition across every tradition that the unconscious mind is not merely personal, it is transpersonal. It connects the individual to a reality larger than the self, to the collective unconscious, to the implicate order, to the divine ground from which all consciousness emerges. Now let us assemble the complete picture. Your unconscious mind operates on 2 levels simultaneously. The first level is personal, the repository of your individual experience. Every memory you have ever formed, every skill you have ever learned, every emotional association you have ever acquired is stored in the unconscious. This is the level that Freud described, that Candle mapped molecularly, that Clapeyron's pin demonstrated, that Damasio's somatic markers access. It is vast, containing orders of magnitude more information than consciousness can access at any given moment. It is sophisticated, making complex decisions with greater accuracy than conscious deliberation, and it is powerful, shaping behavior, perception, and physiology through mechanisms that consciousness cannot detect and cannot override without deliberate effort. But the personal unconscious, for all its vastness, may be only the surface layer of the unconscious mind. Beneath it or beyond it, or enfolded within it, lies what Jung called the collective unconscious and what Bohm called the implicate order, a transpersonal layer of reality that contains not personal memories, but universal patterns, not individual experiences, but archetypal structures, not sensory data, but the deep information of the cosmos itself. The evidence for this transpersonal layer is convergent. The archetypes, the universal patterns that appear across cultures without cultural transmission, suggest a shared source of psychic structure that transcends individual experience. The precognitive dreams and pre-stimulus responses, the unconscious mind's access to information from the future, suggest a connection to a layer of reality that is not bounded by time. The synchronistic events, the causal correlations between inner experience and outer events, suggest a connection to a layer of reality that is not bounded by space. And the mystical experiences reported by contemplatives across every tradition, the uncreated light of the hesychasts, the luminous void of the Buddhists, the Atman Brahman identity of the Hindus, the divine presence of the Sufis, suggest a connection to a layer of reality that is not bounded by the individual self. If the quantum framework is correct, if the implicate order is real, if the quantum vacuum stores holographic information about all events, if the microtubules in neurons function as quantum antennas, then the transpersonal unconscious is not a mystical fantasy. It is a physical reality. The unconscious mind has access to the implicate order because the brain is a quantum system embedded in a quantum universe. The non-local correlations that entangle distant particles also entangle distant minds. The causal connections that link quantum events also link psychic events. And the information that is enfolded in the implicate order information about the past, the present, the future, and the deep structure of reality itself is accessible in principle to any quantum system capable of resonating with it. The brain is such a system, and the unconscious mind operating in the quantum regime, free from the classical constraints of conscious processing, is the faculty through which the resonance occurs. But intellectual honesty requires confronting the objections. The first objection is the evidence. Objection. The evidence for the transpersonal unconscious is suggestive but not conclusive. Bohm's precognition experiments have been criticized for methodological flaws, small effect sizes, potential for selective reporting, and inconsistent replication across laboratories. The Global Consciousness Project's results are statistically significant, but the effect sizes are tiny and the interpretation is contested. Critics argue that the statistical methods inflate false positive rates and that the post hoc selection of events introduces bias. Precognitive dreams are anecdotal, documented in case studies and historical accounts rather than controlled experiments. The archetypes, while culturally universal, can be explained by shared evolutionary pressures, universal human experiences like birth, death, predation, parenting, and hierarchical social organization, rather than by a transpersonal layer of reality. And the Penfield memories, while dramatic, may not be faithful recordings of past events, but rather reconstructions, confabulations, generated by the stimulated brain, rather than retrievals from a perfect archive. The convergence of the evidence is interesting, but convergence is not proof, and interesting is not the same as established. This objection is valid. The evidence for the transpersonal unconscious does not meet the standards of established science. It meets the standards of a hypothesis, a well-formulated, testable, internally consistent hypothesis that is supported by suggestive evidence, but that has not been confirmed by the kind of large-scale, rigorously controlled, independently replicated experiments that scientific consensus requires. The honest position is, the transpersonal unconscious is possible, coherent, and consistent with the quantum framework, but it is not proven. However, and this is crucial, the personal unconscious is proven. The vast, sophisticated, powerful system documented by Zoltman, Libet, Bargh, Dijksterhuis, Hassin, Damasio, and Kandel is established science, published in peer-reviewed journals, replicated across laboratories, and accepted by the scientific community. Even without the transpersonal dimension, the unconscious mind is running your life, making your decisions, shaping your behavior, storing your memories, protecting you from threats, and doing all of this with a sophistication and a reliability that consciousness cannot match. The transpersonal dimension, if real, adds a cosmic connection. But the personal dimension, which is established, is already revolutionary enough to transform your understanding of who you are. The second objection is the mechanism objection. Even if the transpersonal unconscious exists, how does the brain access it? Mitchell's quantum hologram hypothesis is speculative. The connection between microtubules and the quantum vacuum has not been experimentally established. The mechanism by which non-local quantum information could influence neural processing is unknown. Bandyopadhyay's quantum resonance measurements in microtubules are suggestive, but have not been independently replicated. Without a confirmed mechanism, the hypothesis remains a promissory note, a framework that could explain the transpersonal unconscious if its assumptions are confirmed, but that has not been confirmed. This objection is valid in its specifics. The mechanism is not established, but the general principle that quantum effects operate in biological systems and influence macroscopic function is increasingly well supported. Quantum coherence in photosynthesis, documented by Fleming at Berkeley and Engel at the University of Chicago. Quantum entanglement in avian navigation, documented by Ritz and Schulten. Quantum tunneling in enzyme catalysis, documented by Klinman at Berkeley and Scruton at Manchester. The brain operates at the same temperatures, in the same biological medium, with the same molecular components that support quantum effects in these other systems. The proposal that the brain also exploits quantum effects is not a leap of faith. It is an extension of a documented trend. The specific mechanism microtubules accessing holographic information from the quantum vacuum is speculative. The general principle that the brain is a quantum system capable of quantum information processing is increasingly supported by the evidence from quantum biology. The third objection is the Freudian objection. The unconscious mind is not a portal to cosmic wisdom. It is a repository of repressed trauma, suppressed desires, and maladaptive defense mechanisms. Accessing the unconscious does not connect you to the divine. It connects you to your neuroses. The tradition's descriptions of the unconscious as a doorway to the sacred are wishful thinking projections of spiritual longing onto a psychological system that is, at its core, driven by survival needs, sexual drives, and the defensive strategies of a frightened animal. This objection has historical force. Freud's model of the unconscious dominated by the id, driven by the pleasure principle, populated by repressed content, was based on clinical observation of neurotic patients in Victorian Vienna. It is a model of the dysfunctional unconscious, the unconscious that produces symptoms, generates anxiety, and requires therapeutic intervention. But Freud's model is not the only model, and the evidence from Dijksterhuis's superior unconscious decision-making, from Damasio's somatic wisdom, from the creativity research showing that breakthrough insights emerge from unconscious processing, suggests that the unconscious is not merely a repository of pathology. It is also a source of wisdom, creativity, and adaptive intelligence. The unconscious can be neurotic. It can also be wise. And the tradition's practices, meditation, prayer, ethical purification, may be technologies for shifting the unconscious from the neurotic mode to the wise mode, from the defensive mode to the receptive mode, from the contracted mode to the expanded mode that can access the deeper layers of information that the implicate order contains. Now, let us trace the connections to the investigations we have conducted before. The synchronicity. Investigation was an investigation of the unconscious mind. Synchronistic events, meaningful coincidences that defy causal explanation are, in the Pauli-Jung framework, manifestations of the collective unconscious. The inner event, a thought, a dream, a feeling, and the outer event, a phone call, a meeting, a discovery are connected not through causation but through meaning, and the meaning is generated by the unconscious mind, operating at the level of the implicate order, where inner and outer are not separate. Every synchronicity you have ever experienced was the unconscious mind revealing its connection to the larger reality. The meaningful coincidence was not a coincidence. It was a communication from the depths to the surface, from the implicate to the explicate, from the unconscious to the conscious. The placebo investigation was an investigation of the unconscious mind's power over the body. The placebo effect is not a conscious phenomenon. You do not consciously decide to release endorphins or express healing genes. The placebo effect operates through the unconscious, through the implicit memory systems, the somatic markers, the autonomic responses that the conscious mind does not control. The belief in healing is processed by the unconscious. The unconscious generates the neural and hormonal templates of healing, and the body responds not to the conscious belief but to the unconscious processing of the belief. The placebo effect is the unconscious mind healing the body, and the nocebo effect, fear creating disease, is the unconscious mind harming the body. The unconscious does not distinguish between helpful and harmful beliefs. It processes both with the same machinery and produces the biological outcomes that correspond to whatever belief it has received. The free will investigation was an investigation of the relationship between conscious and unconscious minds. Libet's readiness, potential, the unconscious initiation of action before conscious awareness, is the unconscious mind generating a neural template. The conscious veto, the capacity to stop the action after the unconscious has initiated it, is consciousness selecting among the unconscious mind's offerings. Free will, in the STAP framework, is the conscious mind's capacity to select, stabilize, and veto the templates that the unconscious generates. Freedom is not the generation of options, it is the selection among options, and the options are generated by the unconscious. The fear investigation was an investigation of the unconscious mind in its contracted mode. Chronic fear is the unconscious mind locked in a defensive pattern, generating the same threat-oriented templates over and over, stabilizing them through the Zeno effect of fearful attention and producing the biological damage that chronic cortisol, immune suppression, and cardiac incoherence inflict. The epigenetic transmission of fear, Dias and Wrestler's mice. Yehuda's Holocaust survivors is the unconscious mind transmitting its patterns across generations through the molecular machinery of inheritance. And the tradition's prescription for breaking the fear cycle, redirect attention from fear to love, is a prescription for shifting the unconscious mind from the contracted mode to the expanded mode, from the defensive mode to the receptive mode, from the threat-oriented mode to the wholeness-oriented mode. The heart investigation was an investigation of the unconscious mind's primary organ. The heart's 40,000 neurons, its electromagnetic field, its prestimulus responses, its capacity to entrain the brain through vagal signaling. All of these are features of the unconscious mind's cardiac dimension. The heart processes information below the threshold of awareness. It responds to future events before the brain does. It generates a field that communicates emotional information to other people without conscious mediation. And the traditions, every tradition locate the deepest, knowing not in the head, but in the heart. The heart is the unconscious mind's ambassador to the body and to the world. And cardiac coherence, the smooth, ordered, harmonic heart rhythm produced by love, gratitude, and trust, is the state in which the unconscious mind's antenna is most sensitive, its processing most effective, and its connection to the implicate order most open. The AI investigation clarified, by contrast, what the unconscious mind is not. AI processes information. It makes decisions. It generates language. It passes tests. But it does not have an unconscious, not in the sense that the traditions describe. It does not have an Alaya Vijnana storing seeds from past lives. It does not have a Karana Sharira carrying samskaras across incarnations. It does not have a kalb connecting the surface to the divine depth. It does not have dreams that communicate information from the implicate order. The unconscious mind, the real unconscious, the transpersonal unconscious that the traditions describe and the quantum framework supports, is not a computational phenomenon. It is a quantum biological phenomenon. It requires the specific substrate of the living brain, the specific architecture of the neural microtubule network, the specific embedding in a body with a heart that generates a coherent electromagnetic field. The machine has processing, the human has depth, and the depth, the vast, silent, powerful, transpersonal depth of the unconscious mind is what makes you more than a machine. The information leakage investigation explored the unconscious mind's dream channel, the pathway through which information from the implicate order enters conscious awareness during sleep. The investigation documented cases of precognitive dreams, telepathic dreams, and dreams that contained information the dreamer could not have acquired through normal channels. The quantum framework we assembled here provides the mechanism. During REM sleep, the conscious mind's filters are deactivated, the prefrontal cortex is offline, and the unconscious mind operating in the quantum regime, connected to the implicate order through the microtubule antenna, receives information that the waking mind's filters would normally exclude. The dreams are not noise, they are signal from the deepest level of reality, translated into the unconscious mind's symbolic language, delivered to the threshold of consciousness in the only window, when the conscious mind is not blocking the channel. The biological antenna investigation proposed that the body itself is a quantum receiver, and the unconscious mind is the faculty that processes the received signal. The heart's electromagnetic field, the brain's microtubule network, the body's biophotonic emissions. All of these are components of a biological antenna system that the unconscious mind operates. Without conscious awareness or conscious control, the antenna is always on. The signal is always arriving, and the unconscious mind is always processing it, generating intuitions, somatic markers, gut feelings, and the subtle sense of knowing that arrives without evidence and proves accurate more often than chance would predict. The biological antenna is the unconscious mind's hardware. The implicate order is the unconscious mind's signal source, and the traditions, practices, meditation, prayer, cardiac coherence, dream cultivation are the tuning procedures that optimize the antenna's sensitivity and the signal's clarity. And now the practical question, the question that matters more than all the physics and all the traditions. What do you do with this knowledge? How does the recognition that your unconscious mind is running your life and maybe connecting you to the universe change the way you live? The first implication is humility. You are not in charge. Your conscious mind, the part of you that reads, deliberates, and believes it is making decisions, is processing 5% of your cognitive activity. The other 95% is happening without your knowledge, without your consent, without your understanding. The decisions you believe you are making were initiated by your unconscious before you became aware of them. The judgments you believe are rational are shaped by unconscious primes you cannot detect. The intuitions you follow and the fears you obey arise from depths you cannot see. Humility before the unconscious is not weakness, it is accuracy. It is the recognition that the conscious self is a small boat on a vast ocean, and that the ocean, not the boat, determines the currents. The second implication is practice. If the unconscious mind generates the templates from which consciousness selects, if the quality of your life depends on the quality of the unconscious menu, then cultivating the unconscious is the most important thing you can do. This is what the tradition's practices accomplish. Meditation expands the unconscious menu by quieting the conscious mind's chatter and allowing deeper templates to surface. Brewer's fMRI studies confirm this. Experienced meditators show reduced default mode network activity, meaning less self-referential noise, meaning more bandwidth for the unconscious mind's deeper signals to reach consciousness. The meditator is not emptying the mind. The meditator is clearing the channel. Prayer directs the unconscious processing towards specific intentions and opens the channel to the transpersonal dimension. Newberg's neuroimaging of prayer shows altered thalamic gating. The brain's filtering systems reconfigure, allowing signals that are normally screened out to reach conscious awareness. The prayer does not merely ask, it opens. It reconfigures the brain's filtering architecture to admit signals from deeper layers of processing layers that the ordinary waking mind's defensive posture keeps locked out. Dream work interprets the unconscious, mind's symbolic communications, and integrates unconscious content into conscious awareness. The traditions that cultivated dream interpretation, Islam's Ilm al-Tabir, the Talmudic dream interpretation tradition, the Aboriginal dreamtime practices, the Tibetan Buddhist dream yoga, were not engaging in superstition. They were developing technologies for reading the unconscious mind's communications and translating them into conscious understanding. Every dream you remember is a message from the 95% to the 5%, and the message is encoded in symbols because the unconscious mind does not think in words. It thinks in images, in emotions, in spatial relationships, in the archetypal language that Jung spent his career decoding. Ethical purification removes the unconscious patterns, the samskaras, the vasanas, the logismoi that narrow the menu and bias the offerings toward fear, desire, and compulsion. Every tradition prescribes ethical practice, not merely as a moral requirement, but as a psychological technology. When you act with compassion, you deposit seeds of compassion in the alaya vijnana. When you act with generosity, you deposit seeds of generosity. When you act with courage, you deposit seeds of courage. The seeds shape the menu shapes the offerings shape the conscious selections, and the conscious selections shape your life. Ethics is not separate from consciousness. Ethics cultivates the unconscious soil from which consciousness grows, and cardiac coherence practices, HeartMath's quick coherence technique, the Hesychast breath synchronization with the Jesus prayer, Dhikr breathing synchronized with the divine names, pranayama, embryonic breathing in Taoism, optimize the heart's electromagnetic field and enhance the unconscious mind's antenna sensitivity. 5 minutes of cardiac coherence practice produces measurable changes in heart rate variability, cortisol levels, immune function, and cognitive performance. These are not long-term benefits that require years of practice. They are immediate effects that begin within the first minute of practice and that accumulate with repetition into lasting changes in baseline physiology and baseline cognitive function. These are not optional. They are not luxuries for the spiritually inclined. They are maintenance procedures for the most powerful system in your body, the system that is making 95% of your decisions, shaping 95% of your behavior, and connecting you, through the quantum channels of the implicate order, to a reality so vast that consciousness cannot encompass it. Neglecting this system, running it on autopilot, never examining its contents, never expanding its range, never opening its deeper channels, is like owning a radio telescope and using it as a coat rack. The instrument is there, the signals are there, the universe is broadcasting, and you are not listening. The third implication is trust. If the unconscious mind has access to information that consciousness cannot reach, if it processes 11 million bits per second while consciousness manages 40, if it receives pre-stimulus signals from the future, if it generates somatic markers that guide decisions more accurately than rational analysis, then trusting the unconscious is not irrational. It is rational. It is the recognition that the unconscious mind has more data, more processing capacity, and more access to the deep structure of reality than the conscious mind. The gut feeling deserves attention. The intuition deserves respect. The dream deserves interpretation. The sense that something is right or wrong, the somatic marker, the cardiac signal, the unconscious knowing that arrives without reasons deserves trust. not blind trust, not uncritical acceptance, but the informed trust of a person who understands that the unconscious mind is not a random noise generator. It is the most sophisticated information processing system in the known universe, and it is operating inside you right now, generating the templates from which your next decision will be selected. The traditions say, listen to the heart. The neuroscience says, the somatic markers are more accurate than conscious analysis. The quantum physics says, the unconscious has access to the implicate order, 3 voices, 3 languages, 1 instruction. Pay attention to the depth. You are not your conscious mind. You are not the 40 bits per second that you can see. You are the 11 million bits per second that you cannot see, and the connection to the implicate order that the 11 million bits may access. You are the surface and the depth, the boat and the ocean, the candle and the sun. And the sun is shining, has always been shining in the depths of your unconscious, in the storehouse of your alaya vijnana, in the causal body of your karana sharira, in the heart that the hesychast taught you to descend into, in the nafs that Ghazali taught you to polish until it reflects the divine. The unconscious is not your enemy. It is not a Freudian dungeon of repressed desires and traumatic memories. It is your deepest ally, the vast, silent, powerful intelligence that runs your body, protects your life, generates your creativity, stores your wisdom, and connects you, through channels that consciousness cannot perceive, to the universe that produced you and that sustains you in every moment. The traditions understood this. They called the unconscious by 100 names: the heart, the storehouse, the causal body, the nafs, the divine darkness, the cloud of unknowing. But they understood its nature, and they developed, over thousands of years, the technologies for accessing it, technologies that the neuroscience is now beginning to validate, that the quantum physics is now beginning to explain, and that your life is now beginning to need. The door is in your chest, the key is attention, and what lies behind the door is not merely your unconscious mind, it is everything.